Hey everybody, welcome to Acrylics Made Easy. Today I'm going to show you how I like to paint an oak tree. Here we go. On our palette over here, we've got golden fluid acrylics, yellow ochre, this is phthalo blue green shade, and carbon black, and we have titanium white. I'm going to start off with a 1-inch flat brush and load it with some of that carbon black. Now, oak trees are really fun to paint, I think, because they have such varying and interesting shapes to them. There are some trees where almost all of them have a very, sort of similar profile. Oak trees, they can just kind of go all sorts of different ways. So I like to give it a nice big fat trunk to start, and then I'll pull out a couple of these larger branches before I start building the top. But I don't really want to get crazy and draw a whole bunch of branches for an oak tree. What I like to do is, like I said, build out the trunk and a couple of these lower branches, and then I'm going to go ahead and just make sure my brush is loaded up with a whole bunch of that black paint, and then come back to the canvas, and I want to create a shape that's very sort of rough and random, but has an overall sense of sort of being, I wouldn't call it rounded necessarily, but it's wider at the base than it is toward the top. And I like to just keep it solid like this to start, and give it a couple of little spots where it's going to just sort of get a little outside of that main shape. But for the most part, I want it to just kind of stay where it is in this big abstract shape. Okay, and then once I've got it all filled in, I'll take the very corner of this flat brush and just sort of play around with a couple of these edges. Give it a sense of some smaller leaves and branches sort of sticking out from the main body of the tree. And I like to start my trees with this really dark silhouette. I don't always use carbon black, but for the purposes of this video, it's the quickest way to make a really dark silhouette. So, once I've got this tree sort of figured out where it's going to be, I can pull a couple of more branches off of there. But again, I don't want to get too crazy, because I'm going to show you a really fun trick that I learned a few years ago, which is you can make this tree look a whole lot more branchy by adding what's called sky holes. So I'm going to make sure that I have my paint applied real nice and thin. This is fluid acrylic, so it will dry pretty fast. And what I'm going to do is go back to my palette over here, and I'm done with this big flat brush for now. So I'm going to put it in some water so that it won't dry out before I get a chance to use it. And let's get this filbert brush over here. This is a number 6 filbert brush. Anything close to that will work about the same. And I want to make a nice dark green to put onto this tree. So I'm going to get some of this yellow ochre and some of that phthalo blue green shade. Now, why am I using yellow ochre instead of just bright yellow? Well, because I want the tree to have a nice kind of earthy tone to it. Bright yellow and blue together usually make a green that's just a little too vibrant to actually be realistic. So sometimes off yellow, like the yellow ochre, works really well to make the green you're looking for. I'm going to make it a little bit darker over here. I might even add a hint of that carbon black, so we can have a couple of greens in this tree. I'll have a very dark green and then sort of a mid-tone green on top. So here we go. Let's use that darker green. What I like to do is sort of find a couple spots where it looks like, okay, well, I've got a branch that's kind of sticking out here. So since it's already there, I'll just trace across the top of it, but bring it into the center of the tree a little bit. Okay, and I'm just laying the brush on there lightly, almost laying it flat, because I'm trying to get like this largest area of color I can off the brush. Okay, and I'll do the same thing, a little bit lower. Let's get a little bit more paint on the brush first. So some of this nice dark green we just mixed up with the yellow ochre, that phthalo blue green shade, and just a hint of carbon black. And we'll find our next big branch here and just put some across the top. And then you kind of just play around with it. Just drag the brush around. Again, I have it almost laying flat against the canvas. The more perpendicular you are, the more sort of, I don't know, like overly tight and controlled the brush strokes tend to look. And with something like a tree where I want a very natural feel, I find that holding the brush sort of flat to the canvas and holding it pretty loosely in my fingers, kind of let it bounce around, is not only is that a fun way to paint, because it is, but you end up producing results that are actually a lot more realistic. And it's just so cool to me that you can use a technique that actually involves kind of loosening up and freeing yourself up a little bit, and yet get results from that technique that are just actually better results than you would get if you were all uptight about it. I just think that's such a cool thing. So anyway, we're starting to build out some volume on that tree, right? Getting some highlights on, and what I'm just doing is finding these spots where I already have a bit of a branch sticking out, and I'm just saying, okay, well, there's the top, and let me follow along the top with this lighter color. Okay, so that's kind of the darker, deeper green. I'm going to add some of this more of a highlight level green, which is just the yellow ochre and phthalo blue green shade. Let's use just some of that color right there. That's a nice green. And we'll just find where we have already added some lighter color, and we'll just go across and just put that next level. I always find that to create volume in any object, it's helpful to have 3 tones of any color. So I have that really dark carbon black, then I have that mid-tone, actually pretty dark tone green, and then here's this, I guess, more of a mid-tone that I'm putting on top. And that's when you start to really feel the sort of folding over of things and the dimensionality of things. Starting to create that actual 3-dimensional illusion once you get that 3rd tone on there. Right, that's looking pretty good. Alright, now my favorite part. We're going to put the sky holes in there. Okay, so the brush that I've been using, I'm going to put in the water over here so that it'll stay wet until I'm ready to wash it. I'm going to grab this little brush. This is a number 0 liner brush. I'm going to mix up some of my sky color. The sky in the background that I painted before is just phthalo blue, green shade, and titanium white. So I'm going to mix those 2 colors together. Get a nice light version of that color. And here is just my favorite technique for painting trees. So I've got this kind of big blob for the top of the tree, right? It's all very solid. But I can come in here and just sort of invent where a branch cuts through, where there's a gap between the branches, and put these little sky holes on there using that background color. Alright, so if you really want to be accurate with it, you kind of got to adjust the blue, or adjust whatever the sky color is as you move into that deeper blue on the tree here. And then you'd want to adjust that blue so you get a little bit darker. And they don't always have to like really make sense, but it's nice, I think, sometimes to put 2 kind of next to each other and outline where you decided there's a branch. So you don't need a ton of these, but if you put a few in there, it really lightens up the feel and gives you just a really natural, realistic looking tree without, too much work. Something about trying to paint all the branches and then add every leaf as if you're building the tree. That sort of makes sense, but then when you do it that way, it's just so tedious. So it's nice to just sort of, paint this sort of random looking big blob, and then you just cut into it with a few sky holes strategically placed. And end up with something that's beautiful, has a realistic feel, and yet it only takes a few minutes to paint a tree like that. You don't have to spend forever on something to have it come out beautiful. Alright, I could play around with this for a lot longer, but I think for the purposes of what we're doing right now, we're going to call that done. Okay, so thank you so much for joining me. I hope that oak tree painting tip was helpful for you, and make sure to like and subscribe. Acrylics Made Easy, because we're going to paint a whole lot more soon. Thanks, folks.